So without any further ado, I'd like to turn the session over to our moderator. He's a journalist, he's an activist, he's an educator, Louis Duguid. Louis.
Well, thanks, Steve. Thanks for teeing this up nicely, too. That makes my job a little bit easier because then I don't have to say as much. I want to welcome you to the 2020 Greater Kansas City Peace Building Conference. It began in September, examining the mainstream media's influence on peace building and social justice. We had a program in October that focused on Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, and some of the problems that have existed there because of colonialism, but then some of the great peacekeepers of our times, Mahatma Gandhi and others insisting on freedom and peace. Today, we're going to hear from Rabbi Doug Alpert. Oh, and let me also say that this session will be recorded. So if you don't want to be part of that, just hit your record button. But today we'll hear from Rabbi Doug Alpert, a longtime Kansas City resident and spiritual leader of Congregation of Kol Ami, the urban progressive synagogue. Rabbi Alpert received his rabbinic ordination from the Academy for Jewish Religion in New York in 2012. He's a member of the Kansas and Missouri Bar. Rabbi Alpert is active in peace and justice work. He's on the state committee for the Poor People's Campaign and is immediate past president of Missouri Healthcare for All. Rabbi Alpert is an activist leader in Stand Up Kansas City, the fight for $15, that's minimum wage, Missouri Jobs for Justice, Missouri Faith Voices, the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and Mord Squared, or Metropolitan Organization for Racial and Economic Equity. Rabbi Alpert will speak with you today on the Poor People's Campaign, a comprehensive and effective approach to Black Lives Matter and addressing the needs of all marginalized communities.
Louis, thank you. And my thanks to Park University and Johnson County Community College for inviting me to participate in this peace building conference. I think it's a wonderful endeavor. A little trepidatious if I have to follow my friend Eric, but we're each motivated to do better by the other. So I will endeavor to do my best. I have to concede, as my cats stampede by, that's the virtual world in which we live. When I agreed to do this, it didn't really plug into the idea that it was going to be done on November 4th, which immediately follows November 3rd, 2020. My night went till about 1:30, and then it started in the morning again about 4 o'clock. My emotions have been rising and falling throughout. And I can't deny that the results of the election is going to impact the work that I and we do. And by the we, I mean the organizations with which I'm honored to work. And it'll impact how we go forward in our work for racial and economic justice and equity. At the same time, I don't want to overplay the results either. These organizations have been doing the work long before 2016. And while I wish it were otherwise, I suspect the work will need to continue certainly after the inauguration in January 2020, or even 2024 and beyond for that matter. So before I kind of get to the main topic, which is the Poor People's Campaign, I wanted to spend a little time kind of explaining how I got into this work in the first place. What's a nice Jewish boy like me doing in a place like this? And in addition, maybe spend just a moment on Black-Jewish relations and what I think that all means. So I'm going to start, I was born in a log cabin. Actually, what I'm starting with is my father, of blessed memory, who was a builder and a real estate developer, but he was really, back in the day, in late 60s, early 70s, he was the only white developer who had worked with the Black Economic Union in Kansas City. He did a lot of low-cost housing, and he did it not from a place of being this self-conscious liberal, look at me, but more, it's like, why not? It's just, it's part of a business. He enjoyed the business opportunities. He really enjoyed the relationships. And so he was very matter of fact, and his demeanor, his approach to the work that he did with BEU didn't change from any of the other work he did. I will admit I'm a sports nut, and as a kid, my sports heroes that I tended to seem to be primarily Black sports heroes, but and those who carried themselves, I always felt with a good sense of dignity, both in the playing venue and then away from it as well. People like Bill Russell and Muhammad Ali and Arthur Ashe. Maybe the one off the beaten path, I had to go local with somebody. I always wanted to be Otis Taylor and make those one-handed catches on the sideline. Thus, for any number of reasons, it wasn't meant to be. Later in life, and as a teenager, I and my friends had a great fondness and passion for jazz. And we and I have always understood jazz as a Black art form. So I didn't know one day that I would end up being the executive director of the Kansas City Jazz Commission. It was an arm of the mayor's office, and seeing the importance of jazz to the history of Kansas City. And it taught me a lot. Most of my work was in the Black community. My office was in the Lincoln Building in 18th and Vine. And I found that to be a wonderful experience with people who had an enormous generosity of spirit and were always eager to partner, and certainly didn't have to be that way with me. I learned a lot of lessons. I learned a lot about working in the Black community, some really hard lessons. But most of all, I learned the importance of relationships and relationship building and doing this kind of work, whatever work one is doing in the pursuit of a more just community and a more just world. I became a rabbi actually relatively late in life. I was ordained in 2012, and I see myself kind of in the work living out my Jewish values, not just for myself, but as to be the spiritual leader for my congregation. And so I gravitated toward community organizing work and organizations doing work, particularly on racial justice, but other issues of economic injustice and equity as well. And we in the organizations always saw a significant intersection between work on racial justice and economic equity, which is to say that contrary to what I see as a racist narrative, it's not a zero-sum game. In other words, more money in the pockets of the Black community and Black folks is not money out of the pockets of white folks. To the contrary, policies that lift up the Black community will invariably lift up all of us. And I think that's always important to keep in mind and not buy into this other narrative, which I think is a narrative that feeds into white grievance and white fear and racism. And again, the other learning I came to pretty early on in the work, again, is the importance of relationship, but meeting people doing one-on-ones. Virtually all of the community organizing organizations that I've worked with has emphasized the importance of doing one-on-ones on a continual basis. So it's where I've formed some of the most meaningful relationships that I have. And it's a mechanism that's really allowed me to be welcomed into these different spaces. And so I'm very appreciative of those opportunities, which leads me into one more thought before I get into the Poor People's Campaign. And that's regarding Black-Jewish relations. So as a Jew, and even before I became a rabbi in 2012, I look back with pride on what I had viewed as the strong relationships forged between the Black community and the Jewish community. I already had mentioned with pride my late father's work, and we'd often referred to Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel marching with Dr. King and Selma. And we had this understanding that in a way we had this special bond. Yet those relationships are not now what they were then actually through the 60s and maybe a little beyond. And maybe they were never the relationships that I thought that they had been. There's been a rift between the communities that's taken place in the intervening years since the 60s. Jews were full participants in white flight to the extent that we possibly could engage in white flight. And I say to the extent possible just because, particularly in suburbs like Old Leawood, there were deed restrictions that said no Jews, no blacks. And so what ended up happening for my family is when they wanted to engage in white flight, we went about as far south as one could go into the suburbs on the Kansas side, around then 103rd and Row, which was about the end of civilization. But to also give you an idea of how the Jewish community has moved out, the synagogue I grew up in, when I was a kid, we used to go down to 34th and Paseo, now Victorious Life Church. And now that same synagogue is at 145th and Lamar. So that pretty well tracks a lion's share of the Jew, not all, but a lion's share of the Jewish community. I've been pretty open about acknowledging this piece, you know, in Black spaces. And I think it's important that you kind of acknowledge your own stuff. And I want to do so. When I do it, I want to do it in a way that doesn't become either the focus of the work or doesn't become some kind of, oh, I'm so guilty, I'm sorry. I actually, as an aside, I was an election chaplain at one of the polling sites yesterday, and I had my yarmulke on, and somebody who professed being a devout Christian came up to me, dropped down on his knees and apologized to me for all the things Christians had done to the Jews. And I assured him that that was in no way necessary. But it also, you know, that kind of guilt doesn't move anything forward. And so I try not to engage in that. But I think, you know, owning your stuff is important and vital to make progress. And the other piece of tension as it relates to Black-Jewish relations is this perspective that I guess I would associate most prominently with Louis Farrakhan, that Jews are somehow uniquely racist. And this is an idea that I reject out of hand. Or for Farrakhan, that we are somehow satanic. I reject that one too, by the way. And at the same time, this has been a source of controversy within the Jewish community. And I urge at least my own congregants that they should never use that as an excuse not to be at the table. They should never use that as an excuse not to engage in the work. And it's only by showing up that opinions are changed. So with that, let me talk a bit about the Poor People's Campaign. And I want to start with kind of an overarching perspective on why I think the Poor People's Campaign is a vital and needed narrative. So after the murder of George Floyd and the much increased focus on Black Lives Matter that ensued, and as an aside, I say why it was George Floyd and not Michael Brown or Tamir Rice, or for God's sakes, Emmett Till for that matter. Anyway, I digress. The focus after George Floyd, the focus of the Black Lives Matter movement was and is most associated with police-involved racial profiling and a physical abuse or killing of African Americans. The co-chair of the present Poor People's Campaign, and I'll get into the present and the old one, Reverend Dr. William Barber, did many interviews. There was Oprah Winfrey had done a whole long series with a two-part series with a panel of prominent Black leaders, including Reverend Dr. Barber. And he characterized the issue not as Black Lives Matter, but as one of Black deaths and the appalling and distressing comfort level that our country had with Black death. And in so doing, I thought he broadened the narrative. So the idea of police brutality and racial profiling is one area of Black Lives Matter, but we know that the disproportionately large percentage of premature and unnecessary Black mortality comes about in many ways, not just with issues regarding policing, but in other issues as well. And Reverend Dr. Barber seemed to be really successful as broadening how we look at all this. So let me circle back to the original Poor People's Campaign, 1967-68. The campaign founded by the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So there were three pillars in the original Poor People's Campaign. The first was racism and racial inequality. The second being economic inequity and injustice. And the third was militarization. And so back in that time, when you think of militarization, think of people who were protesting against the Vietnam War. And in the original campaign, the racial and economic injustice really became aligned by Dr. King with the Memphis sanitation worker strike. And that's what brought him to Memphis and ultimately where he got assassinated. So fast forward to today's Poor People's Campaign, the effort's been about a 4-year-old effort. I can remember that Reverend Barber was in Topeka. He had a moral revival tour that he was doing, but part of it was, unbeknownst to us, he was doing workshops for us. And that's where we first got introduced to the Poor People's Campaign. He co-chairs the campaign with Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis, and it incorporates the three original pillars. So there is the pillar of systemic racism, which includes voter suppression and attacks on immigrants and asylum seekers and attacks on indigenous communities, poverty and economic inequality. So this goes back to the idea, if you go back to the 2016 election, and actually even not enough in this election, words that you never heard any of the candidates utter or address were poverty, poor people. You know, it's usually couched in terms of the middle class. And the poor people seem to be persistently demonized as if they had done something unlawful to be poor, or it's through nothing more than their own devices, or Jared Kushner just came out with this, racist trope about, Black people don't want to be, they have to want to be as successful as we want them to be. That kind of garbage. So Reverend Dr. Barber and Reverend Dr. Theoharis was looking to get that narrative, force that narrative back onto those who seek to represent us. So those issues would include childhood poverty and the impact of poverty on women and LGBTQ discrimination, alleviating student debt and really predatory lending, which is pretty rampant here, at least on the Missouri side, housing and homelessness, healthcare access, living wages, and criminalization of the poor. So the third pillar, militarism, takes on kind of a different slant today. So today it's more about the obscene amount of money budgeted for defense spending in lieu of dollars that could be budgeted for education, healthcare, for veterans, to help bolster the economy. So we pay not just the $15 minimum wage, but actually pay people a living wage, which is, by example, for a single parent of one child, is more like $22 an hour, at least here in Kansas City. It also addresses the idea of militarization of our society through the proliferation of guns. And I think that's an important piece that's added in. So since the original campaign, 2 other pillars have been added. When the new campaign started, from the get-go, there was the pillar of ecological devastation, which disproportionately impacts the poor and communities of color. If you live in a nicer neighborhood or out in the burbs, you don't have a brownfield site sitting next to your house. And more recently, there's been added yet another pillar, which is the pillar addressing white supremacist movements, the religious right, neo-Nazi movements, which is, as we know, it's a real threat. So some of the actions that have been taken on by the Poor People's Campaign, back in 2018, they did a series of 5 weeks of civil disobedience in each of the state capitals. So we were up in Jeff City every Monday for 5 weeks, parking ourselves in the street and getting arrested. We've held rallies on different issues. We've done teaching events. We've town halls. We did a gubernatorial town hall. In Washington, they've been actually doing kind of this Mitch McConnell Monday thing where they've been protesting at his office over just his base cruelty, honestly. And the important thing with all these actions is whenever we can, we try and lift up impacted people. So what they have to say and how they tell their own story is much more powerful, much more meaningful, infinitely more important than anything that I have to say as a faith leader. So to kind of button it up for now, and then I'm looking forward to the discussion that follows, I wanted to briefly mention some of the organizations that locally that kind of fit in with the work of Poor People's Campaign. So mentioned, and I know Eric's involved, Stand Up KC, the fight for a living wage and a union, because you need the union to fight things like sexual harassment and sexual abuse on the job, healthcare access, and to get proper healthcare coverage for workers, low wage workers like McDonald's workers. Missouri Faith Voices, who does a lot of work addressing racism. Lately, it's been a lot of focus on issues of voter suppression. Missouri Healthcare for All and Healthcare Access, the NAACP, Moore Square and Metro Organization for Racial and Economic Equity. They do a lot of work around the policing issue, but they also over time have done work on education, on healthcare access, on immigrant rights. Missouri Jobs with Justice, they are very active on things like some of the ballot initiatives that you've seen in the last couple of elections. And then Migrant Farm Workers Alliance Fund. There's actually somebody connected through one of our congregants who I've known for a long time. She's kind of a hero of mine in the activist community. And she works with mostly migrant farm workers up in Lafayette County. And we try and give them financial support in any way we can. So with that, this seems like a good time to break off, and I'm eager for discussion and questions.
Well, Luana, thank you for launching us into this topic, because I think it opens things up to a lot of questions. People who have questions, please feel free to add them to the chat box, and I'll share those with our speaker. One question I have is how is it possible to break down the barriers of segregation? This is one of the most segregated cities in the country, and there doesn't appear to be any effort to have that sort of dissipate. How might we, through efforts like yours, make that happen?
Well, I tell my folks, you need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, which means you need to, for white people, I think it means, you know, don't sit siloed in you're on your west side of Troost. You need to be moving into Black space and supporting Black causes. So for us, one of the things that we did, we actually called, my congregation Kolomee had a building at its 75th and Belinder, which honestly, I was not enthralled with. And after a year there, we got out of the building, and ever since then, we have not owned a building. We lease space for worship in different places. All Souls at 45th and Warwick for a significant amount, but other places as well. And we started a community garden at 43rd and Forest in order to really, one, I had people in my congregation who like to garden, not me, not if you want anything to grow anyway. But it put my folks in space with people they otherwise would never meet. So, and the opportunities that have been created have been significant. The garden has grown tremendously over the last 7-8 years. But in addition to that, there was a woman who actually across the street from the garden was murdered. The following Saturday, we had scheduled our regular Shabbat Sabbath morning service there. It turned into a focal point so the neighborhood could come together, and her father and her son also came, and Mothers in Charge showed up, and it was just a place where people could come together. And so we recognized the power of just showing up, just being there. As to how we solve the bigger issues of segregation, to, you know, resolve what had been years of redlining in Kansas City, and you know, realtor discrimination, banking institution discrimination. To me, it's a more difficult one. I think it starts with far greater investment in the Black community and solving things like, you know, the food desert that exists east of Troost. The other thing about, and I say Troost has always been kind of known as the Mason-Dixon line in Kansas City, but if you kind of really focus in, there's some stuff going on, and that line is subtly moving. And so our first thought is, that's great. We're, you know, white folks are moving east of Troost. It's wonderful. We're finally going to integrate. But it's like, be careful, because the impression is what might be happening instead is white people are moving east of Troost and you know, building, you know, renovating homes and so on and so forth, and pushing Black people further east. So instead of having an integrated neighborhood, the fear is that that line will move from Troost to Prospect. So I'm keenly interested in how that dynamic takes shape. But I do think to focus on investing in Black businesses, Black community, putting money into the Black community, I think actually is the place to start in terms of desegregating. I'm much, as between the two, if I got to choose, I'm much more interested in investment and seeing how better efforts at integration will follow from there.
Okay, here's another question. Are politicians right that there is no constituency for those who favor assisting the poor? How do we build such a constituency?
Well, Poor People's Campaign is kind of placing their bet that there is a constituency. You know, we talk in Stand Up KC, we talk about low wage workers, and, you know, and those who don't have a living wage, and thus the poverty line is about 64 million. It's a lot of votes if we can mobilize. And I think that's ultimately what we're looking to do, is mobilize the disenfranchised, that marginalized group, and to let our politicians know that that is a constituency, and, you know, with a lot of good work and organizing, that it'll be a constituency that'll actually go out and vote. It's not easy. It's, you know, if your day-to-day life is challenged and you're just trying to get some food on the table every night, it's hard to get beyond that, and the exhaustion and the emotional wear and tear that comes with that kind of life, to do anything more. But you know, with low wage workers, we've seen it. They can do it, and they are the leaders. They are articulate and brilliant and committed, and that makes for a pretty good constituency. So I'm actually excited for the potential, and I think it's there. We just have to create the space for it a little more.
Can you share the 2 or 3 main impediments to alleviating poverty in Kansas City, and then, of course, the rest of the country?
Well, certainly the you know, the long-standing racism and racial divide that's gone on in Kansas City. If you're not living it, then it's easy to separate yourself from it. And I think, you know, and who knows whether it's a pandemic or something else that'll trigger a different response, that'll tell people, you know, I can't live out here in my comfortable house and act like nothing else is going on. The world eventually will creep in on me. and my existence is not as stable as maybe I thought it was. And I've said in relation to issues on gun control and the horrible homicide rate in Kansas City, that if those numbers were coming down in Leawood, the problem would be solved by now. So it's changing the narrative from that's happening to their kids to it's happening to our kids.
Gotcha. In the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, one effective method that King employed was getting arrested. And I wonder how effective that's been now with the work that you're doing. If you find that people who are staging these protests outside of Mitch McConnell's office are actually making things better.
I think it does bring needed attention to issues. So I've done it twice, spent one night in jail, wouldn't recommend it. And actually, I had the one night I spent in jail, I had encounters with 4 different police officers, 2 which were wonderful. Actually, one of them apologized for arresting me, and I had to assure him that I had voluntarily put myself in that position. But another one kind of snidely popped off. He says, "So is it worth it?" And I said, "Well, yeah, historically, I think it has been worth it. And for me to do it, if nothing else, it lets those who I'm doing it with, like in this case, it was Stand Up KC, so it was fast food and other low wage workers, to let them know that somebody cares about them and is willing to stand with them." So I think there's some positive impact from that. I will caution, though, for people who are going to go out and say, I'm kicking ass, I'm going to get arrested, I'm going out on the line. We do a lot of organizing and training before we engage in civil disobedience, and we don't do it very often. Like I said, I've done it twice since 2015, so it hasn't been a lot. But you've got to be organized, and you have to be respectful of who you're putting out there. So if, for example, if we have people that we are signing up to participate, and for some reason, Kansas City is we make records every time we do it. We had 108 people arrested in 2015 with Stand Up KC. Over the course of 5 weeks with Poor People's Campaign, I think we had over 200 people arrested, which I don't know if it's a record to boast about or not. We led the country. Our state led the country in arrests, and most of that came from the Kansas City area. But if you're going to put people in that position, you need to find out if they're in the system, and if getting them arrested is going to get them in a lot more trouble than a misdemeanor for not obeying a lawful police order, which is what the original arrest was for me. So you have to be very intentional about it. You need to train your people, and if you do all those right things and you know what your goal is in doing it, then yeah, I think it has a benefit. Absolutely.
And looking over the scope of the work that you've done, particularly to bring attention to the African American community, to poverty, which events stand out the most as being the most effective?
Well, we did a week of camping out and fasting at City Hall to get the minimum wage passed. And within the context of Kansas City, Missouri, it got passed. Now, the state short-circuited us, as they are apt to do. But it just, in terms of kind of this direct correlation, I've seen that work. More Squared has done they've done a lot of great work in a lot of places, but the one specific one is their work in the criminal justice system in KCK and Wyandotte County. They've really shined a bright light on the issue and gotten some real wins. And I think that's kind of the other thing about any action that you would engage in. your ability. I mean, sometimes you just have to attack an issue because it's just wrong, regardless of your chance of getting a victory. And a lot of this stuff is a marathon, not a sprint. So it's going to take years to get the victory that you're seeking. But you also have to be mindful sometimes of getting some wins, because it puts a deposit in your power bank. If you start to get wins, your organization is taken more seriously, and wins begat more wins. So I think that piece is important as well, and how you balance between, I mean, when Stand Up KC and the stand up movement started, to suggest a minimum wage of $15 an hour was an absurdity. Nobody thought it was possible. What are you guys doing? And now we know it's more than possible. We see it all over the country. So it's kind of this balancing act that we engage in all the time, and doing short-term work versus working over a long-term, and how we can be most effective.
What are your thoughts on the education system in the Kansas City area? We have just a plethora of charter schools, and then struggling Kansas City, Missouri school district, and then struggling Kansas City, Kansas school district. And then you go outside of those areas and you find school districts that have newer buildings, better facilities, better teachers, and teachers who live in the community versus the teachers in the urban areas who don't live there at all.
It's kind of a yes, but my eldest got married a few weeks ago, and with that, his wife, my daughter-in-law, brought 2 daughters with her into the marriage. So I immediately, I performed the ceremony, and by the end of the ceremony, I'd become a grandfather. They had been at a Montessori school in the Kansas City School District and were doing amazingly well and loved the school, and the school was and is doing great work. Through an issue with her ex, they ended up having to shift to a Shawnee Mission School. And the Shawnee Mission School doesn't hold a candle to Harold Holliday Montessori. So I know the reputations, and I know the assumptions we make, but I also think that there's some real wonderful possibilities and real potential for growth, and some really good things that are starting to happen, at least on the Missouri side in the Kansas City School District. So, and for my congregants, I've had congregants that have they did have kids, and others that do have kids in the district, and they all seem fairly pleased. So, my message is kind of don't give up on the Kansas City School District. I think they're doing some incredible things, and I like the direction they're going in. And to us, I just don't. I'm a product of the Shawnee Mission District, and it had the reputation when I was going through school of being one of the top 5 districts in the country. It isn't. It's certainly not now. So, the assumptions we make, we should take a harder look.
Gotcha.
But I mean, actually, but in addressing your point, yes, there needs to be more resources committed to those urban school districts.
To piggyback on to that question, what are your thoughts on having a universal preschool in Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas City, Kansas? I know that there were efforts toward that a few years ago, and then they seem to have gone away.
Yes, everybody's identified that the intellectual development that takes place with preschool age kids is essential. So I think it ought to be available, and much like healthcare, I think it ought to be a right.
Okay. Can you point to any specific things that you yourself have done that you've seen as a benefit to the African American community?
It's hard to specify. I mean, I work with all these organizations, and I try and work in a way that I stand with and don't and give advice when solicited, but not think that I have an answer that Black leaders don't have. It goes back to my discussion of Black-Jewish relations, and I think one of the mistakes that was made in the Jewish community is, we have a shared past of discrimination and persecution. Jews have been through it. Let us tell you how to solve the problem. And I'm very careful not to get into that space, to say, look, I'm here to stand with you and support you. So I've been blessed with many opportunities to speak at rallies. I'm clergy. I like getting up in front of a bunch of people and tell them how to live their lives. It's part of the job description. But I've had this discussion. I'll tell you, one of the people with whom I'm closest with in Kansas City is Reverend Dr. Rodney Williams, who's Swope Parkway United Christian Church, but also the president of the Kansas City branch of the NAACP. And we talk about it. We talk about all sorts of things a lot, but we talk about the power of just showing up. And as often as we speak, there are other times where we just show up and say, whoever's speaking, whatever you're saying is important enough for us to show up and just be in a position to stand with and support. I actually think that's the most effective thing I do is just that showing up piece.
Gotcha. We have a lot of college students on this Zoom call. So what advice would you give to individuals who are young adults and looking at this and wondering, what can I do?
Well, as young adults, I would emphasize adults, and that you don't have to wait, not just to be involved, but to show some leadership on whatever it is that you want to work on. They listed, Lewis listed all sorts of organizations that I'm involved with. I do that. I'm spread pretty thin, but I do that because I think it's really important to have a Jewish voice in all these spaces. And that, particularly for any issues that go on in the urban core, I seem to more often not to be the voice. But I am more a promoter of finding a couple of things that you're really passionate about and working on those things. I think you're more effective than if you spread yourself too thin. So find and actually that's how these relationships are made too. I've seen efforts in the past where synagogues have, gone to Black churches and say, let's get together, let's get to know each other better. We'll solve all the world's problems and we'll end segregation. And they start out with all good intention, and then there's burnout, and then it just kind of fizzles off and everybody thinks it was a failure. It is much more effective if you come together to work on the issues that are important. So you have a shared goal and you're not just showing up to say, hey, let's be together. I think it works much better if you're working on stuff, whether it be raising the minimum wage and promoting unions or whatever, healthcare access, whatever it is.
Here's another question that will probably challenge your knowledge. What are the similarities and differences between anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism? And is this essentially the same battle?
Well, there are two. I'll go with the differences first, and there are two big differences. One is we came here by choice, and my grandparents came over from Vilna in Lithuania because they didn't like where they lived and they wanted to live here. And skin color. For whatever amount of discrimination Jews faced, and we did face pretty significant anti-Semitism, we have throughout our history, we never had to sit in the back of anybody's bus. And I think that is a significant difference. So there's a book called Jews and Jazz. It turns out I was the only rabbi in town who had been director of the city's jazz commission. So the author came to town and spoke at the American Jazz Museum. I got to introduce the author, so I read the book. And it describes Jews as having both this insider and outsider status. And that's why we like to be involved with jazz so much, that it allowed us to kind of have a foot in the door to be more American, to be more included as Americans. And yet at the same time, we kind of liked our outsider status, and and jazz also had this kind of outsider mystique, this rebellious mystique that went on at the same time. So we kind of play both sides of the street in that way. So in a way, to the extent that we share some sense of marginalization, and that we both receive the ire of white supremacist and neo-Nazi movements. Charlottesville, if you'll recall, it was about a protest to take down against taking down Confederate statues, but the chant was "Jews will not replace us." So they were clearly there, the neo-Nazis and white supremacists, they were there for racist purpose, but they managed to toss us into the mix pretty comfortably as well. So I think, there's a lot of those groups, militia groups, that have a disdain both for Blacks and for Jews.
Gotcha. The civil rights movement did a lot of things, but one of the things that I find it deficient in is giving women a voice and a place to be just as forthright as men were. How do you see women playing a role in the movement for a livable wage, healthcare, etc.?
Front and center. So true confessions, my person originally when the presidential campaign started was Elizabeth Warren. I think we're like beyond ready to have a woman as president, and really believe that there's real power in it. I'm married to a woman with a powerful voice, and I wouldn't want it any other way. And I do think, to the extent you want to stereotype or compartmentalize it all, I think women would add a different, better perspective to leadership in all fronts. And as it relates specifically to like Stand Up KC, we have a number of women who've taken leadership roles, who've testified before Congress, who've given interviews with national press, and they have moved it forward. They have definitely had a positive impact and moved the ball forward for the Stand Up KC movement.
Another question. What has the effect of the coronavirus been on the efforts toward equality and equity?
Well, it's certainly kind of shown a bright light on the inequity. You probably all have heard the statistics and how coronavirus has disproportionately impacted Black lives and brown lives and Latinx community, and indigenous people as well. Those groups have all suffered greatly, more significantly with the pandemic than white folks. And it's kind of like, we've been saying this all along, and maybe now you'll see it. It's so obvious. So I think, and whether there's a response based on that reality and that fact, we'll see.
Another question that kind of piggybacks on this, because the coronavirus has been such a huge issue in the presidential campaign, is which candidate do you think would best move the needle in the work that you're doing, presidential candidate?
Is this a trick question?
I thought that I had to ask just so that you could get that in front of people so that we'll know where you stand.
You know, if I have a litmus test for, you know, somebody running for elected office, it's whether or not they will legislate and or govern with compassion. So if you just simply ask yourself between Joe Biden and Trump, who is the more compassionate, empathetic person, then that gives you your answer as to who I think is going to do an infinitely better job addressing the pandemic. You know, one thing that doesn't seem to come up often enough is that, again, it's presented as this trade-off between lockdown and getting the economy up and running again. You know, we had one round of significant aid, not significant enough, and then the House passed a bill in May, and it's just waylaid in the Senate ever since. We can do, you know, if not a full lockdown, certainly, you know, more social distancing and you know, more stay at home, and still get the financial support that people need to be able to carry that on. And so, you know, small businesses aren't dying out, and the employees of those businesses, you know, I think of restaurants as what comes to mind immediately, aren't, you know, without jobs forever and no prospect of finding the next job. You know, we know what to do, but for some reason that one piece just gets lost in the argument, and I'm not sure why.
Rabbi, what do you see as the next steps that are needed, both in Kansas City, state of Missouri and Kansas, and then nationally?
Steps, there's so much work to do. I think we keep pushing on these issues of justice and equity that we need. We need to have a real, not just conversation, but a real way to address racial inequality and racism. It's got to be a real discussion. And, you know, if you can't get with the idea that we have a history of racism, then, you know, I mean, it's so obvious. it just frustrates me. So I think we have to find ways to address that. Well, and that's in all areas. It's in healthcare access, it's in employment opportunities, it's in education, it's in a new way to train police. It didn't come up. I'm, you know, in addition to being a full-throated supporter of Black Lives Matter, I'm also a chaplain for KCPD, because I think police are in need and deserve pastoral care. And because I think the problem is, we talk about systemic racism. So the problem is the system. And if we put a just system in place, then you'll find out pretty quickly that, you know, to the argument made by police, and having met a number of police, believe it, there are a lot of good police who want to do good in the community and care. And then you'll find, but if you have the right system in place, then you'll find out about the ones who aren't pretty quickly. And so we've got to look at these systemic markers of racism and economic injustice, and we need some significant change. The healthcare system has to change. I'm a past president of Missouri Healthcare for All, and we actually don't care which system you employ, whether it's Medicare for All or some kind of universal health care or whatever it is, but everybody needs to have access to good, decent health care. So, I mean, there are a lot of issues. We need to observe the law when it comes to asylum seekers. Our president and those sycophants who work for him, who are doing these awful things at the border, they're actually breaking asylum laws. There are asylum laws on the books that allow people to come in to seek asylum, and we are not honoring those laws. It's not who we're supposed to be. So, I mean, there's a lot of work in a lot of different areas and a lot of things that need change, but I'll circle back to kind of where I started with all this. Is job one is to just engender a sense of compassion in how we govern and lead in the world.
Well, Rabbi, I want to thank you for taking the time, for giving us an inspirational message and some things that we individually can do to make a difference. And I want to thank all of the participants for your questions and for the energy that you've devoted to this program. We will begin again tomorrow. And Steve, do you want to talk to that?
Yes. So tomorrow we have 3 sessions. The first at 11 a.m. with Reverend Dr. Vernon Howard talking about racism. The second at 12:30 p.m. Talking about healthcare with Councilwoman Melissa Robinson. And the third tomorrow evening with Mayor Quinton Lucas talking about gun violence. You see the address pasted into the chat, so you can find out more details at that address. You can also register for tomorrow's programming. Thank you again, Rabbi Alpert, Louis Duguid, and until tomorrow, take care. We'll see you later.